Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us. We're just going to wait a couple minutes for additional people to join the Zoom call, and we'll get started shortly. Thanks. Hi, we do have people who are continuing to come into the meeting right now. So we are just going to give it a few more minutes for everybody to be able to join and see us, and then we'll go ahead and get started. Thanks. Okay, great. We're going to go ahead and get started. We do have people who are still joining, but in the interest of time, why don't we kick things off? First of all, welcome. Thank you for coming to this virtual information session on the SoHoNoHo neighborhood planning process. We're delighted to see that there are currently over 320 people in attendance tonight. And we thank you all for taking time from your evening to be here with us tonight. I'd like to note that we're also live streaming this meeting on our Department of City Planning website. And to allow as many people as possible to participate in the meeting, I would like to ask that any of you that prefer to simply watch tonight's event to do so on the live stream at nyc.gov/SoHoNoHo plan. That's nyc.gov/SoHoNoHo plan. And before we get started, I'd like to introduce the people that you see on your screen tonight, starting with me. I'm Eric Botsford, Deputy Director of the Manhattan office at DCP, the Department of City Planning. And I'm joined by Sylvia Lee, our planning team leader and project supervisor for the SoHoNoHo neighborhood plan. And also Nabila Malik, who is a senior planner in the Manhattan office. We have several other people from DCP that are on the line. You won't be hearing from them tonight, but you will certainly see them over the course of the upcoming planning process. I'm sure many of you participated in at least one or perhaps all of the 40+ meetings that took place last year and were part of the Envision SoHoNoHo public engagement process. We at City Planning learned so much from you over those 6 months. And the report that came out of Envision SoHoNoHo provides us with a really solid foundation as we move into the next phase of work, the SoHoNoHo neighborhood plan. Tonight, you'll learn much more about the report, as well as the neighborhood planning process that kicks off with this meeting. And we are here to answer questions that you may have about the process that is to come. We're at the very beginning of planning for SoHo and NoHo, and tonight is just the first of many opportunities for you to learn more about the plan as it's developed, and for us to hear directly from you as we plan for the future of these two extraordinarily unique neighborhoods. Following close on the heels of tonight's meeting will be another public meeting on December 3rd, the environmental scoping meeting. We encourage you to attend that meeting as well to provide your comments, and you'll learn much more about the environmental review process and the scoping meeting tonight in this presentation. So, okay, we've got a lot of ground to cover, and I'm going to hand this over now to Sylvia and Nabila to take things over. Again, thank you very much for coming tonight.
Thank you, Eric, for the opening remarks. My name is Sylvia Lee, planner at the Department of City Planning. Before we start, I just wanted to acknowledge that the COVID-19 pandemic has upended life as we knew it. I'd like to thank you all for joining us virtually tonight in this very challenging time for many people in SoHoNoHo and in our city. Debbie, could we please share the presentation? Next slide, please. Before diving into substance, a quick note on general housekeeping. At any time during the event, you may submit your questions in writing by using the Zoom Q&A feature or by emailing soho-noho@planning.nyc.gov. My colleagues will be monitoring these questions throughout the event. The instructions will also remain at the bottom of the slides for your reference during the entire presentation. After the presentation, we'll also have a Q&A session where we'll answer questions submitted in writing and also take questions from those who wish to speak. In order to be inclusive and respectful of different levels of comfort and different preferences, we'll alternate between written questions and those who wish to ask questions verbally. Next slide, please. We ask that you be respectful of one another, collectively abide by these ground rules, and try to limit your question within 2 minutes so that we can get to as many questions as possible tonight. I'll note that the meeting is scheduled to end at 8 p.m. to be respectful of everybody's time, and we'll go through the presentation fairly quickly and dedicate as much time as possible for the Q&A. Next slide, please. For those of you who are less familiar with the Zoom video conference platform, here are some tips to help orient you to the platform. Please note that all participants will remain muted during the presentation portion of the meeting. Anytime during the whole event, you can communicate with us by using the Q&A feature on the Zoom platform or by email. We'll collect questions and answer them at the end. If you wish to ask a question verbally rather than using the other methods after the presentation, you may raise your hand by clicking on the raise hand icon or by pressing *9 if you are tuning in on your phone. We'll call on you in order and allow you to unmute yourself on the Zoom platform or on your phone so that you can ask your question. If you run into technical difficulties during the event, we also have a separate hotline that you can call into. Staff will also be monitoring that and will be able to assist you. Again, the instructions will be at the bottom of each slide. We'll also repeat this instruction again before we start the Q&A. With that, next slide, please. If you are joining late, here's the run of show tonight that Eric has already alluded to. In the next 2 hours or so, the three of us, supported by the many colleagues that are working in the background, will be sharing some information on the SoHoNoHo neighborhood plan, how you can participate in the upcoming public review processes, and answer your questions. Again, our goal is to go through hopefully an informative presentation in the first 30 to 40 minutes and dedicate the rest of the meeting to the live Q&A session. Building on the foundational Envision SoHoNoHo engagement work, which a lot of you participated in 2019, we are kicking off the next phase of this neighborhood planning effort. As Eric mentioned in his opening remarks, we are at the outset of a process to develop and refine a neighborhood plan, which will include a zoning proposal, relevant environmental documents, as well as strategies beyond zoning itself. We hope tonight's session is the continuation of the robust public dialogue we had as part of Envision SoHoNoHo and a productive start of the next stage of this important planning effort for the future of SoHoNoHo. Next slide, please. The neighborhood plan study area generally encompasses the SoHoNoHo neighborhoods within Manhattan Community District 2. These are iconic neighborhoods that are also centrally located, highly accessible by transit, adjacent to major educational institutions, healthcare facilities, and other mixed-use neighborhoods. The majority of the area is characterized and protected by 6 historic districts. A point of quick clarification, the current zoning does not have contextual zoning or controls on building forms or height that align well with the characters of the historic districts in SoHoNoHo. These 2 neighborhoods are also within 2 unique manufacturing districts, the M15A and M15B districts. They were established in 1971 and only mapped in these 2 neighborhoods to address the unique conditions of the neighborhoods at the time. This last zoning change in SoHoNoHo in the 1970s, in a way, reflected a creative effort to help the neighborhoods adapt to a changing economy and land use reality. It reserved space for manufacturing jobs that were still present at the time, but also allowed vacant buildings to be repurposed for new uses, including joint living work quarters for artists. In other words, in 1971, zoning was revised so that SoHoNoHo could change with the time. Fast forward, we're at a similar juncture where the neighborhoods have evolved beyond what zoning was designed for. Aspects of existing zoning, among them the lack of allowance for residential use and affordable housing requirement, also run contrary to the progressive values of our city. As echoed by many residents, businesses, property owners, and others during and since the Envision SoHoNoHo process, this mismatch between existing zoning and the current neighborhood conditions makes certain aspects of living, finding housing, and doing business in SoHoNoHo very challenging. We hope that the neighborhood plan is an opportunity for us to come together, examine the 5-decade-old zoning against the demand of our time and our collective values. Next slide, please. Again, this is the agenda. With that, I'll walk you through a few slides to provide a brief overview of Envision SoHoNoHo in 2019, how the findings and recommendations from that engagement report help us formulate the planning objectives of the neighborhood plan, after which my colleague Nabila will share information on how you can stay updated and participate in the upcoming public meetings. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. In 2019, co-sponsored by Manhattan Borough President Brewer, Councilmember Chin, and the Department of City Planning, the Envision SoHoNoHo engagement process convened over 40 stakeholder and public meetings to discuss the various facets of the planning, zoning, and other issues that concern the residents and businesses in SoHoNoHo. Next slide, please. This effort was steered and guided by an 18-member advisory group comprised of a diverse set of stakeholders who regularly met to discuss a wide-ranging topics and carefully considered public input as well as perspectives from a series focus group discussions. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Months of stakeholder dialogue and hard work of the advisory group, as well as participants in our events, culminated in the Envision SoHoNoHo report, which was established in published in November 2019. Next slide, please. The report provides a documentation of the engagement effort and lays out a set of recommendations organized around these three main themes that emerge in the process: quality of life, neighborhood diversity related to housing, and economic diversity governing non-residential activities in the area. We went through these recommendations in detail in January, where we presented the report. The full report, as well as the recording of the event, are still posted on the Envision SoHoNoHo website. Here, next slide, please. Tonight, I'll simply note that since the publication of the report, we spent a lot of time digesting the comprehensive effort that reflects the diverse voices and perspectives of the participant over the course of the engagement, and worked to translate the overarching principles and creative ideas in the report into planning goals of the SoHoNoHo neighborhood plan. Next slide, please. I'll reiterate what Eric alluded to in the beginning. We are at the beginning of the neighborhood planning process, and your questions tonight, as well as input in the months to come, will continue to help shape the neighborhood plan. Next slide, please. One of the key messages embedded in a principle of promoting neighborhood diversity is, one, to fully recognize all residents, certified artists, makers, and others as part of the community, and at the same time explore more housing and live work opportunities so that Soho and NoHo become more open and welcoming. This theme has also been amplified by many since the release of the Envision SoHoNoHo report. The existing manufacturing zoning, by not allowing residential use as of right and not requiring affordable housing, presents a barrier to accomplishing this important shared goal. The neighborhood plan carries this vision forward as part of a series of strategies. Next slide, please. Envision SoHoNoHo notably also recognizes the dynamic mixed-use conditions in the neighborhoods as a strength and calls for a broader allowance for commercial, light manufacturing, community facility, and other compatible uses as of right. Equally as important is quality of life. As a response, the neighborhood plan will seek to support the business community, strengthen mixed use with appropriate and flexible zoning, paired with public realm strategies so that residents and businesses exist in harmony. As noted in the report, this involves working with agencies and local partners to pursue better management of commercial deliveries, street cleaning, as well as solid waste. Next slide, please. Just as important is to find new ways so that SoHoNoHo's arts and cultural legacy can continue to benefit the neighborhoods, as well as new generations of artists and creative workforce businesses all around the city. This also includes making sure that existing arts, culture, and creative activities and businesses in the neighborhood today are supported and are given room to change, grow, and take on new forms. Next slide, please. Last but not least, the neighborhood plan also carries forward the important guidance that the unique historic character in SoHoNoHo be protected and enhanced. This is an intention of the neighborhood plan that appropriate density and housing affordability is accommodated in a thoughtful and sensible way, and that zoning controls as well as LPC review can guide new development to enhance instead of detract from the cast iron loft architecture and historic character that is well beloved by the community and the world. Next slide, please. These 4 neighborhood planning goals are intended to work together to address the needs of the local SoHoNoHo community, reflect shared goals and values of our city, and respond to the new and ever-evolving land use and economic conditions and realities now and in the future. To advance these goals, more specific action items within and outside of zoning have been identified, obviously in draft form, in these 4 buckets: housing, commercial and light manufacturing, arts and culture, density, and design. Next slide, please. Informed by Envision SoHoNoHo and by our commitment to advance fair housing, the neighborhood plan will introduce residential use, require affordable housing for the first time in Soho and NoHo. It is important to leverage the strong market in SoHoNoHo to provide housing and affordable housing. The plan will also provide flexible options that allow for varied residential and live-work options, not limited to certified artists. Existing joint living work quarters for artists will continue to be permitted. Loft law protections and rent regulations will remain in place. Next slide, please. Beyond housing, the neighborhood plan takes from Envision and of uses. This includes retail, office, creative production, arts and culture, food and beverage, and other types of compatible uses. This is intended to strengthen the dynamic mix of uses we already see in SoHoNoHo and create room for new types of activities and businesses and business models. With a rapidly changing economic reality in light of COVID-19, zoning flexibility is one of the tools we have to support recovery, business innovation, and adaptation in the months and years to come. As noted previously, the plan will also ensure that these zoning moves will be complemented by strategies that better manage the public realm and advance quality of life improvements. Next slide, please. The neighborhood plan also includes strategies within and outside of zoning to support arts, culture, and creative businesses so that SoHoNoHo's cultural legacy continues into the future and its reach can extend beyond the boundaries of these two neighborhoods. The neighborhood plan will also look to advance the recommendations from SoHoNoHo, Envision SoHoNoHo, to create a mechanism so that various occupancies in joint living workers for artists can be legalized and simplified, while also contributing to supporting arts and culture in new ways and in ways that are beneficial and accessible to the SoHoNoHo community and beyond. Next slide, please. As previously mentioned, the existing manufacturing zoning has no height limits, and this has allowed construction of out-of-context development on tall towers, upwards of 300 feet in the neighborhood. The neighborhood plan will replace the existing zoning with new building envelopes and use contextual zoning tools to shape future development. The plan will recognize different characters and context in areas within historic districts and areas that are outside, provide suitable density allowances and zoning controls so that new development and affordable housing can be built in SoHoNoHo within building forms that enhance the historic district and respond to neighborhood context. Next slide, please. This slide sums up key elements of the neighborhood plan, which will continue to be developed and refined in the months to come. The neighborhood plan will replace existing manufacturing zoning with a new special SoHoNoHo mixed-use district where a wider range of residential, commercial, and light manufacturing uses will be permitted. The plan will also map SoHoNoHo as a mandatory inclusionary housing area, requiring affordable housing in new infill developments and residential conversions that exceed the standard MIH thresholds. The plan will also recognize different characters of different parts of the area with distinct sub-districts with different regulations. Within the historic cores of SoHoNoHo, these are more residential areas on the side streets. The plan would maintain existing density that is allowed today and establish contextual zoning with height limits and special rules to ensure new developments match the predominant heights and the look of the historic districts. Along wide streets and commercial corridors, also within historic district, contextual zoning would also be used to accommodate increased density and match up and ensure that new development match up to taller and denser context that already exist along Broadway and Lafayette corridors today. Provisions that preserve major concentration of commercial and production space will also be introduced here to ensure that SoHoNoHo remains a critical hub for jobs and commerce. Outside of historic districts is where we see major opportunities for housing. The plan would seek to maximize housing potential, including permanently affordable housing at increased densities with appropriate building envelopes that resemble the large loft-like buildings in SoHoNoHo today. As mentioned earlier, the neighborhood plan is also the platform on which we will work with DOT, sanitation, DCLA, and other city agencies to consider and advance strategies that can work in unison with zoning to support the various planning goals, including quality of life improvements, supports the arts and culture, and small businesses. Next slide, please. With that, I'd like to turn it over to my colleague, Nabila Malik, to provide information on the upcoming environmental review and land use review processes.
Thank you, Sylvia. Hello, everyone. My name is Nabila, and I'm a planner in the Manhattan office. Before we get started, I just wanted to clear up a few questions we've been getting. One, the presentation and this event is being recorded and will be posted on our website tomorrow. And some of you have been wondering about the raise hand feature that will be enabled during the question and answer session, and we'll provide further instructions then. All right, so now we're moving into the processes going forward. Next slide, please. So I'm going to walk through the environmental and land use processes. So I'll explain each of the components in the graphic to help you understand key points of public input. The graphic you see here shows that we are coming out of the community engagement process, Envision SoHoNoHo, that Sylvia recapped for us earlier, and moving into developing a neighborhood plan proposal supported by what we learned during the Envision SoHoNoHo process. We hope that by sharing these processes in full, you feel more equipped with understanding when and how you can participate, especially now that we are operating mostly in a virtual world. The important thing to note here, and as we've shown in the graphic, is that the proposal is being developed and refined throughout this process and has not yet been finalized. Next slide. Okay, there are a lot of acronyms about to come at you, and I know process talk can be a little tedious, but I really do hope that through it you get a clear picture of the opportunities you have to share your recommendations and ask your questions. So the City Environmental Quality Review, or SEQR, is the process by which we identify potential environmental and neighborhood impacts from a new land use proposal and study them to inform the project. It's one of the first more formalized steps in establishing a land use proposal. There are different deliverables that SEQR produces depending on the land use actions, but in this case, the SoHoNoHo neighborhood plan requires an environmental impact statement, an EIS, which is the most extensive type of review. Next slide, please. So why is this process important? SEQR allows participants in the public review process to evaluate project benefits and the new needs it might produce. It also ensures mitigation measures are identified for adverse environmental impacts. Next slide, please. So the draft scope of work is the first step towards producing an environmental impact statement and further developing a proposal. The scope of work for SoHoNoHo will be released on Wednesday, October 28th. It establishes the scope of what environmental components need to be analyzed to inform the neighborhood plan proposal. It's important to note here, and as you all access the document on the 28th, that the scope does not establish the final neighborhood plan proposal, but rather it's providing a framework in which to analyze potential environmental impacts. It essentially establishes parameters of a project to conduct analysis. Next slide, please. Okay, the scoping meeting will be the next opportunity for the public to provide input on the scope of the project for environmental review. This is where you can provide recommendations on what should or shouldn't be included in the analysis. The scoping meeting will be held on December 3rd, and you will be able to register online on our website at nyc.gov/SoHoNoHo plan. I'll talk more about the scoping meeting at the end. Next slide, please. So public and other comments from the scoping meeting are reviewed and incorporated into the final scope of work, which initiates analysis for the draft environmental impact statement. Next slide, please. So the draft environmental impact statement discloses environmental data to inform public and decision makers and outlines possible mitigation measures for potential impacts. It also analyzes alternatives to the proposal, and the draft EIS enters public review to be commented on during the land use process. Next slide, please. So the final environmental impact statement, the final EIS, comes later in the process prior to any project approval once the analysis has been finalized. The final EIS revises the draft EIS based on comments received during the ULURP public review process and refines that data and analysis. Next slide. Okay, the land use process. I know many of you are very familiar with this, but for the benefit of those who are new to the process, I'd like to walk through the Uniform Land Use Review Procedure, or ULURP, because even us planners need refreshers on this sometimes. As you may know, ULURP is a standardized procedure for public review of land use applications and involves many participants, including you, the Department of City Planning, the City Planning Commission, community boards, and elected officials. Next slide, please. So for the SoHoNoHo neighborhood plan, we are currently in the pre-certification phase, where we are developing the proposal, working on the scoping, and then refining the land use proposal. We prepare an application and are responsible for certifying that the neighborhood plan proposal application is complete and ready for public review at the time of certification. The application is presented and certified at the City Planning Commission review session. And it's important to clarify here that certification is not actually the end of a project. Certification just means that the land use application for the proposal is complete and comprehensive, ready for the public to review and provide input. I'll also note that the draft EIS must be issued before the application can be certified. So if the application is certified, it is then sent within 9 days to Community Board 2, the Borough President, and City Council. Next slide, please. When the application comes to the Community Board, it is required to hold a public hearing and adopt and submit a written recommendation to the City Planning Commission and Borough President within 60 days. This is a chance for the public to participate in the Community Board's hearing and provide comment. The Borough President can then submit a written recommendation to the CPC within 30 days. The Borough President has the option of holding a public hearing as well. I'll also note that this process includes review of the draft EIS, not just the land use application. Next slide, please. So after the Community Board and Borough President have had the chance to comment, the CPC must hold a public hearing and approve with modifications or disapprove the application within 60 days. Anyone can attend and sign up to speak on the proposal and draft EIS. Next slide, please. So the City Planning Commission considers all public comments, written and verbal, prior to the vote. All comments on the draft EIS are reviewed as well, and the final EIS is issued 10 days prior to the vote. Next slide, please. So if approved by the City Planning Commission, City Council will hold a public hearing and approve with modifications or disapprove the City Planning Commission's decision. City Council will issue a notice for the public hearing. Next slide, please. So I just outlined these processes to help you get a sense of where you'll be able to continue to participate and demonstrate that there are many factors involved in finalizing the neighborhood plan proposal. There are some immediate next steps for public participation. Next slide. So today you can ask questions during our question and answer session. And this meeting and presentation will be posted online. You can review the draft scope of work, which is to be posted on Wednesday, October 28th, and attend the scoping meeting on December 3rd if you have comments. And as always, you can stay up to date on our website, nyc.gov/SoHoNoHo plan. Next slide, please. So very soon after tonight's meeting, we will have another opportunity for public participation at the December 3rd scoping hearing, where you will be able to provide comments on the draft scope of work. You can register to attend and/or speak at the scoping meeting on our website, and written comments will be accepted for 15 days following the scoping meeting. Next slide, please. Lastly, this is the project team at the Department of City Planning that will be working on the SoHoNoHo neighborhood plan. You can get in touch with us by emailing soho-noho@planning.nyc.gov. Next slide, please. All right, so we're going to have a 5-minute break and come back for the Q&A session. Attendees can continue submitting questions in the Q&A chat or by email at soho-noho@planning.nyc.gov. We're currently monitoring both. The raise hand feature will be made available during the session. And for those dialing in, you can press *9 to raise your hand if you have a question. See you in 5 minutes. All right, welcome back, everyone. We're going to begin the Q&A session. So next slide, please. Okay. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your evenings to join and participate. I'd like to note that this is a question and answer session, and we're hoping to provide answers to your questions regarding the neighborhood plan process. If you don't have a particular question but do have comments, we welcome you to submit those via email so that we can get to as many questions as possible tonight. I'll also remind you that there will be opportunity to provide testimony at the scoping meeting on December 3rd. Next slide, please. Just very quickly, again, these are your options you have to ask your question. You can submit through the Q&A feature, as many of you already have. You can email us at soho-noho@planning.nyc.gov. And you can raise your hand. You should be able to see the raise hand feature at the bottom of your screen now. And for those dialing in, you can press *9 to raise your hand. I will be serving as moderator for this session. We've received many written questions via the Q&A feature, and I see many raised hands. The way it will work is that I will alternate between written questions we're receiving from the Q&A box and email, and then those that have raised their hands, and we'll continue to go back and forth. Just so you're aware, we're grouping similar written questions together so that we can answer as many as possible. And if you have raised your hand, my colleague Jose will be calling out your name and letting you know that you can unmute yourself. If you're dialing in, Jose will announce the last 3 digits of your phone number since we can't see your names. We will have a timer on screen to help you keep track while you ask your question. And there's a bell warning for when you have 15 seconds left, and you'll also hear the timer go off at the end. Next slide, please. We'd like to get to as many questions as possible. If you do raise your hand to ask a question, please be mindful of the time limit and keep your question as concise as possible. And in order to be inclusive and respectful of different preferences and comfort levels, we will alternate between written questions and those who wish to ask them verbally. Next slide, please. Just a reminder on where you can find relevant Zoom features on your screen. You see the Q&A box, the raise hand feature, and the mute unmute button, which will be enabled on our end once we call on you to speak if you have raised your hand. All right, so I'll go ahead and begin. If we could get the timer screen on. Thank you. Okay, and so we will begin with 2 speakers who have raised their hands for questions.
All right, my name is Jose. I apologize in advance if I mispronounce your last name or your name. Barry Holden, I will give you the ability to speak right now.
Okay, can you hear me? Okay,
Yeah,
well,
yes.
I actually asked the questions on the Q&A as well, so if I overdo it, because it only shows 3, not everybody's questions. First question is, have you dealt with traffic patterns? We have been, it's been told to us that possibly Mercer Street, since it's now at a different zone on the east side as it is on the west, we're on the west side. We're told that there might be a lot of traffic coming up Mercer as a new traffic pattern is established. Do you want to hear all 3 or one question at a time or what?
You can ask all 3. We're taking notes.
Okay. Second question is, what will change in particular with historic buildings, landmark buildings, typical SoHo buildings? Will any of the zoning changes that are in other areas, the yellow, the pink, the blue, will they all be separate zoning issues in terms of what can be built? And within that question, um, uh, what's the difference on a street that has two sides, that has two zones in it? Usually that's one of the problems with zoning in general. So I said, what will be allowed on the east side of Mercer as opposed to the west side of Mercer in terms of what people can build and how tall they can go, et cetera. And I think that question is good for any street that has two sides split up. And in terms of density, we're currently 1,200 square feet minimum for residential. Will that be changed? And also, just how are you going to get light and air in buildings when there's only 5 or 10 foot setbacks in a lot of the historic buildings? Thank you.
Great, these are good questions. Thank you very much. So I'll go through them one by one. So on traffic patterns, thank you for the question. I think as part of the environmental review, traffic is one of the areas that will be carefully analyzed. At this time, we don't, I think this is a very early stage. We're still preparing the early, set of environmental review documents. I think this is a comment or question that is well suited for the upcoming environmental review scoping meeting. And obviously, as part of the neighborhood plan, as well as the environmental review process, DOT would be at the table looking at some of these issues. Two, with regards to the landmark buildings and historic buildings within historic districts. As mentioned, I think the neighborhood plan intends to take a nuanced approach with regards to density as well as bulk controls. The idea is that the plan will recognize distinct characters within SoHoNoHo, within historic districts. There will be kind of different tiers of density, if you will, depending on your location along corridors, major corridors versus side streets. I think this is fairly typical within any area. Zoning district will be drawn based on characters of the area, as well as kind of the character that the zoning seeks to enable in new development. Existing landmark buildings will continue to be protected. Other buildings within historic districts will continue to require review by the LPC, and we would require kind of the same level of scrutiny for any exterior changes. That includes new construction as well as enlargement. I think your questions about two sides of the streets, I think that is a very good question and good observation. We're again at a very early stage. I think the intention is to look at different areas differently and devise appropriate boundaries for different zoning districts. With regards to the 1,200 square feet minimum size requirement, I think you're referencing and the unit size requirement. I think, here we're very early in the neighborhood planning process. I would say that, minimum unit size, especially large minimum unit size is not always a good tool to make sure that housing units are produced to be inclusive of people of varied incomes and different needs. So I think this is one of the areas that will be examined by the neighborhood plan. Thanks again for your question.
Thank you, Sylvia. I just want to make two notes. One, please limit your question to one so that we can get to as many people as possible. And two, if you have submitted your question in writing via email or the Q&A box, we will be getting to those, so you don't have to raise your hand as well. Just want to make sure you know that those will be covered. Jose, do you want to go ahead and get the others?
Yes. The next person will be Andrew Bernan.
Hi, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
We can.
Thanks. So I have a couple of questions. One is, you say this is the beginning of the process, but we've all read in the papers that the mayor has already announced his plans in terms of upzoning and changing the rules for retail. So it seems sort of a little inconsistent to say that it's the beginning of the process. And I'm wondering if you can provide more information about what the plan changes are in terms of retail, and if you can tell us whether or not it won't just result in more large chain stores in the neighborhood. I also want to ask, in terms of the issue of upzoning, why the city is not willing to consider just requiring new affordable housing as a part of all new development in the neighborhood without requiring an upzoning, which is what other cities do and what the courts have upheld, and why this administration insists on attaching it to an upzoning, which really just enriches developers who in many cases are major donors to the mayor's campaign. I also want to ask where the estimate comes from for 32,000 units of housing and 800 units of affordable housing. Given that your plan is entirely market driven, wouldn't you say that that's really, you have no idea how many units are going to get built, and the only time units will get built is if and when a for-profit developer feels that it's within their interests to do so? And then lastly, regarding the commercial corridors, you say you're going to propose an upzoning there. But the existing zoning already allows buildings to be created that are as big as, if not bigger than, and in some cases they are bigger than the existing buildings on them. So won't an upzoning in the commercial corridors result in out of context development?
Thank you very much for the questions. So to, sorry, that's our pickaxe. So thank you very much for the questions. And to answer your questions, a couple of your questions, just to clarify, we are truly at the beginning of the planning process right now. We are coming out of the Envision SoHoNoHo public engagement process, which, as we said, delivered to us a report that contained a number of recommendations. And, I think we certainly find that these recommendations are very compelling. And, you speak specifically to retail recommendations in the neighborhood. And, again, I think during the process, we heard very clearly from many people that there are frustrations with the 5-decade-old zoning in SoHoNoHo that really only permits manufacturing, industrial uses on the ground floors of buildings. And does not permit storefronts generally. And so we, we do think that this is an area that deserves attention as part of the planning process. But we are truly at the outset of a proposal right now. And there's still much work to be done in the development of that proposal. And Nabila walked through that whole process leading up to the presentation of a final proposal to the City Planning Commission, which will take place next year at certification. The environmental review process will also help to identify a number of areas for study in the neighborhood. With regard to the number of units, you said 32,000 units in your question. I'm sure that it was just an error there. We are projecting 3,200 new units. That's 3,200 units as part of the environmental analysis. And again, as was described in the presentation, the environmental analysis has a particular purpose to identify the outer bounds of a possible proposal, to be as conservative as possible for the purposes of environmental analysis, to help us understand what the impacts might be in a hypothetical scenario. And we use that to stake those outer bounds to, again, to help us understand what the greatest amount of potential impact could be to the environment, to the neighborhood, to residents. That does not mean that that is the final proposal that advances into public review. And it is quite common for proposals to change following environmental scoping meetings, such as the one that will take place on December 3rd, as we hear comments from the public and as the proposal continues to be developed and refined over the subsequent months. And then finally, you asked, I think, a really good question that I'm sure many people have on their minds about what an upzoning would mean, what an increase in allowable density would mean in areas that already have large buildings, such as along Broadway, for example, and what that would mean for new buildings that could be constructed in these areas. And one thing I think is really critically important to emphasize is that this 50-year-old zoning that's in place right now has no height limits at all, anywhere in SoHo or NoHo. There are no height limits. And we have an opportunity through this zoning review proposal process to discuss, hear from you, to determine what the most appropriate, best built form is for buildings that would be constructed here. And as we described in the presentation today, the proposal that we have in its current early form contains buildings of limited height for the first time in SoHoNoHo, contextual building forms, that's what we call them. Buildings that look more like the loft buildings that you see in Soho today than tall, skinny towers. We're not proposing to permit tall, skinny towers in SoHoNoHo, even though they are permitted today. That is something that we currently would plan to change in the zoning. And it is very possible to accommodate additional density, more housing, more affordable housing in building forms that look like loft buildings and look like buildings that exist in the neighborhood today. Many of the big buildings in SoHoNoHo today are built to significantly higher densities than what's permitted by the existing zoning because they predate the zoning that was put into place in the 1960s and 70s. But thank you for your questions.
Great, thank you, Eric. So now I'm going to move into two of the written questions. So the first one is, can you discuss spaces currently covered by the loft law? Can you confirm that buildings currently covered by the loft law will remain covered?
Thank you for your question. I'd like to first say that, we know that, and we've heard from many people as part of the mission SoHoNoHo that, loft conversions governed by the loft law has historically been a very useful tool for the neighborhood, and especially the rent regulation that comes with a lot of these conversions and under the loft law is very, very critical. I'll say that, the neighborhood plan intends to maintain that. There's nothing being contemplated to, detract from the existing protections under the loft law. And I'll just say that, the loft law is part of the state multiple dwelling law, kind of provides a separate set of regulations for residential conversions in Soho and also beyond. So the changes within zoning wouldn't interfere with that. Thanks for the question.
Thanks, Sylvia. Second question is, what does better manage the public realm actually mean?
I can take that question again. At this early stage, again, what we've started to think about is the set of recommendations included in the Envision SoHoNoHo process. So the Envision SoHoNoHo spells out several kind of priorities for the community, for residents in SoHoNoHo. And that includes alleviating street and sidewalk congestion, implementing best practices for loading, unloading of commercial deliveries, best practices for street cleaning and trash pickups, maximizing opportunities for open space, community space, as well as, kind of improving enforcement of various rules. So I think the neighborhood plan is really the great platform that we can all use to bring the agencies to the table to further examine a lot of these ideas and to identify, as part of the neighborhood plan, actionable items that could be carried forward, either operationally by the city or partnering with local partners such as the BIDs and other organizations. Again, this is very early, and these are some early ideas we took from Envision SoHoNoHo, and we look forward to hearing our continued input. Thank you.
Great. We'll move to two speakers who have raised their hands.
Jonathan, you will be next.
Howdy, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, we can.
Perfect. All right, so I see a lot of people say that SoHoNoHo rezone is an opportunity for big box chains to proliferate. My question is, in light of the recent George Floyd unrest, it's called attention to mass incarceration and over-policing that happen in our cities. Police forces that create mass incarceration and over-policing often comes from our own communities, and specifically lobbying. Big box stores are one of the biggest lobbyists when it comes to increasing mass incarceration, specifically when it comes to anti-shoplifting laws. A lot of big box stores such as the Apple Store, Century 21, Rite Aid, Best Buy, and Walgreens have successfully lobbied New York State for what they call, quote, Walmart burglary laws to impose harsher penalties for shoplifting, a crime that is usually out of poverty and necessity. My question is, in light of the fact that we are doing this rezone centered around making more affordable housing, how, I have the rest of my question put here somewhere. Anyways, how are we designing this zoning to help protect the low-income people politically who will be in that neighborhood? Are we going to be destroying with one hand what we build with the other? Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for that question. It's I think it's a very challenging question, that speaks to many things that go well beyond the admittedly limited world of zoning. I think it's something that, I certainly need to learn more about, I'll admit, myself. And, I do think that you point out, some very interesting points regarding, large stores and their operational practices that I personally was not aware of. I think as we move through this process, it's something that we have to continue to pay attention to at this stage in the process. Where we are at this early point, I think it's, premature for us to respond directly to, that specific comment. But, do encourage you to continue to, raise those concerns throughout this process. And, we do look forward to continuing to hear from you about that. Thank you.
Michael, you're next.
Hi, my name is Michael Levine. By way of introduction, I am the retired city planner who 50 years ago occupied the position that Sylvia is in right now. So hi, Sylvia, it's so good to see you again. My question to the staff who worked on this zoning text or is working on it now 50 years after the original version that I wrote is twofold. Number one, we created the M15A and M15B to distinguish the different kinds of buildings in areas that artists could legally occupy for joint living work quarters, because we knew that the artists wanted the smaller buildings and industry wanted the larger buildings. And that was the main reason we created the M15A and M15B. A second decision we made at that time was that everything would be as of right, although there have been changes made in the past since then, but we wanted everything to be as of right with as little regulation as possible to allow the artists and the industries to remain as cohabitants of Soho area. My question is, if we do away with the M15A and M15B and create the new special purpose district, will it be one district with one set of regulations, or as is true with many of the special purpose districts, will there be sub areas with different use and bulk regulations? Second and final related question, will everything be as of right in the sub areas or in the complete area, or will there be special permits or certifications and authorizations requiring community approval? Are you at a point now in your work that you can tell us if you've thought that far in advance, or if these concepts are still in your mind? Is it one district with sub areas, and is everything use and bulk as of right? Thank you for the opportunity to speak.
Thank you, Michael. I'll take your question. So first question with regards to the new special district and its structure. As I mentioned, as part of the presentation, I think the intention is that the new special district will also recognize the, kind of different types of characters within different parts of Soho and NoHo. I think, as you rightly pointed out, the M15A is different from the M15B, hence the current distinction among the two areas. I think the new zoning will examine the buildings that are in different areas, their sizes and uses, as against kind of the planning goals that we are looking to achieve as part of the neighborhood plan. So to answer your question, we intend that the special district will have different sub areas with different use and bulk regulations. It is very early on in the process. As part of the development and refinement of the neighborhood plan, what those areas are, how they're distinguished will be contemplated and discussed as part of the process. With regards to allowing uses as a right versus allowing them by special permit, I'll point to kind of this consensus coming out of Envision SoHoNoHo, which is that allowing wider range of uses that are compatible is an important goal. And I think that's a sentiment shared by many stakeholders that came to our meetings. We recognize that, onerous regulations and special permit processes, especially for uses that are appropriate and should be permitted as a right. But then again, this is an early process. I think we want to examine different uses and different areas of SoHoNoHo differently. Thank you again for your question.
Thanks, Sylvia. Okay, moving into two written questions. The first one is, the existing residential population is almost 8,000. What is the % increase in residents that you currently project or are considering?
Well, I'll take that. As we said in response to a question that was asked earlier, the environmental scoping materials anticipate that up to 3,200 new residential homes could result from a rezoning in SoHoNoHo, including up to 800 affordable. Again, though, that is those are numbers that come from analysis, developed for the purposes of this scoping exercise. So they make certain assumptions about a draft zoning proposal for the purposes of analysis. That number will continue to be looked at as the zoning proposal is finalized. It may adjust over time in response to things that we hear during the scoping process and in the lead up to a final proposal that will go to the City Planning Commission. And then of course, during the public review process, as we hear from the community board, the borough president, from all of you in the public participating at public hearings, from elected officials, there are further opportunities for adjustments to be made that could affect that particular number. So at this current early stage of the process, it is anticipated to be 3,200 homes that could be created in SoHo and NoHo. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. Another written question is, why can't this very important rezoning not be postponed until the COVID vaccine is introduced and we have a real public community meeting? Isn't DCP controlling this 100%, deciding on who to call on and which questions to address?
Well, I'll say that it's a concern that I think we certainly understand. And this is a new experience for all of us. While holding meetings virtually has the potential to allow more people to participate than might be able to come out to an in-person meeting, in the evening, if you have young children, for example, or a job that doesn't permit it, we do recognize that, it is very different from being live and in person in a room together. And we certainly value those opportunities. And for the person who asked the question, you may know that the city's public review, land use review process was paused for a number of months during the height of COVID crisis here in New York City, while the city focused on, very urgent matters at hand with responding to the crisis. But that pause in our land use review process has ended. And it is, we think really critically important that the city take up the business again of matters related to planning and land use, because they do provide the opportunity for us to advance projects that are really important to the city's recovery. And those include things like healthcare, new housing opportunities for New Yorkers, economic recovery opportunities. These are things that in many cases rely on the city's land use review. I'm sorry, pause there for a second. So, we do think that it is important that that we proceed with projects like SoHoNoHo in this neighborhood planning process. To not move forward, to wait until we have a vaccine, which I think we don't know obviously when that's going to be, would I think really could detrimentally affect the city's ability to recover. And we want to be able to do everything we can, and we're going to really try our absolute hardest to hear from everybody in this new virtual engagement environment. And this is one tool we have on Zoom, and we are very happy to hear other people's ideas, and we're certainly exploring many other ideas to engage with you, to hear from you, for you to hear from us, and hopefully we will all be able to be in a room together again very soon, and hopefully before this process is out. But thank you very much for your comment and your question.
Thank you. We'll move to two speakers.
Ankur Dalal, you should be able to speak.
Hi, thank you for this opportunity. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Great, thank you. First of all, I want to say I am so excited to hear about this proposal to build 3,200 new apartments and homes in SoHo, including 800 new affordable ones. I think this is an incredible move to add new homes to a high need, high opportunity part of the city with great transit and access to jobs. And I'm so excited to hear that you are exploring the possibility of doing this. And I'm so supportive of it. I want to know, is there any possibility, because so much of Soho is part of a historic district with pre-war loft architecture that's denser than what's often allowed in construction today, will there be any possibility to maximize density within the historic district on empty lots or on low-rise one-story buildings to match the density of the buildings with the greatest residential density on their block, so that they're contextual but also can have as many homes as possible for people? Thank you.
Thank you for your question. I can take that. I think that, as mentioned as part of the presentation, the new special district would intend to kind of recognize different character and context of different parts of SoHoNoHo within historic district and outside of historic district. I think we can all recognize that there are and different types of buildings that are currently there. I think the intention is to, one, allow residential use in the entire SoHoNoHo, so that, residential buildings can be built on sites that are available for a new development. I think we want to think very carefully about how additional density can be accommodated in a thoughtful way, so that the existing historic character and neighborhood context can be responded to appropriately. Thank you for your suggestion and your input as well.
Christopher Marty, you should be able to speak now.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yes.
So we all know these types of rezoning don't happen in a vacuum. And once you upzone one neighborhood, it could cause displacement in communities nearby it. The city typically says that these are unfortunate side effects of rezoning with actually addressing it. So the SoHoNoHo rezoning would create displacement potentially in the Lower East Side in Chinatown, especially since, according to the map, a lot of the areas where you're gonna add density and new development is on the border with Chinatown. Can DCP commit to doing a study on displacement before moving forward with the rezoning and showing ways the city plans to mitigate this side effect? Second, we've opened schools, we have allowed kids to go into schools. Why can't we have a public physical meeting to allow some of our seniors who don't have the technological advantages of getting on a Zoom or entering on a call, so then we can make sure that this process is actually allowing everyone to have a voice?
Thank you very much for your questions. So to start with your first question regarding displacement, both direct displacement of people from where they live, as well as indirect displacement that comes as a secondary effect of zoning changes are both things that are studied as part of environmental impact analyses and will be part of this environmental impact statement for Soho and NoHo. This is I think an excellent comment to be provided as part of the scoping meeting that will be held on December 3rd, either in person or in writing. And, again, it is something that is looked at as part of our environmental analyses. And then the second question that you had, which I am, I'm sorry, I'm Sylvia, can you remind me of what it was, please? Excuse me, everyone. Or Nabila.
Sorry, I was muted too. The second question is about is there opportunity to have in-person meetings so that those who cannot dial in on the internet? Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. And boy, I'm sorry for forgetting that. Keeping a lot of things in my head at one time here tonight. But thank you for that comment. I think, we are certainly aware that there are some people who, don't have the same access to technology and to, participate in meetings like this or capacity with the technology. I will say that, for the, time being, we are, the Department of City Planning is conducting public meetings in a virtual setting. When that will change to in-person meetings, I think is, something that remains to be seen. And, I'm certainly not aware of when that might take place. That being said, as I said earlier, we are completely open to different ideas for how to hear from people, and especially people who don't have access to technology resources. Again, that's something that we are working on, and hear you loud and clear on that, on the importance of that. And we will we'll definitely identify ways to give people access to this process. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you. Moving on to 2 more written questions. So the Envision SoHoNoHo report has a number of suggested areas for further analysis and study. When and what additional study or analysis did DCP conduct in line with those suggested areas, and what additional data and information has been collected?
Thank you. That is a very good question. Like I mentioned earlier, since the publication of the report, we've spent a lot of time to digest the kind of recommendations and ideas that emerged from Envision SoHoNoHo. And I think the neighborhood plan and this next phase of the planning effort will serve as a platform to address some of those areas that need to be need further analysis. I think bringing the agencies to the table to talk about exactly what quality of life improvements can be addressed and advanced is an important one. And I think there are questions about outstanding items about kind of how to enhance and reinforce the existing rent regulations that currently exist in the neighborhood. That is something that is outside of zoning, but the neighborhood plan will provide, again, a platform for us to resume the discussion of some of those items.
Thank you. So the next question is, could you please provide an estimated time frame for the scoping, environmental, and land use processes?
I almost feel like Nabila, you're the best one to answer that question. So correct me if I misspeak. As Nabila mentioned in her portion of the presentation, the environmental scoping meeting will be held in early December. You'll see the environmental documents related to that meeting very soon. So that is the beginning of a process that's usually several months long. And I think we're still at a very early stage. Typically, I think the time between the kickoff of environmental review and the time where a proposal will be ready for the commission's consideration and for certification could be anywhere between 4 to 9 months. So I think we'll see how things go, and this is the very beginning of a long process with lots of opportunities to participate.
Thank you. We'll be moving on to 2 speakers.
Sorry. Nicholas, you should be able to speak.
Hi, can you all hear me?
Yes.
Great. So the city's in a housing crisis, and the only serious long-term solution to a housing crisis is to build more housing. Every piece of empirical evidence, and I mean literally every single piece of empirical evidence, says that more housing means lower rents, or at least rents that rise more slowly. And I could give you a lot of examples of this, but to spare you, I'll just point out that a recent study by Kate Pennington found that new market rate housing in San Francisco meaningfully reduced rent in nearby apartments and reduced displacement, going to an earlier commenter's point. So allowing more housing in Soho won't by itself solve New York City's housing crisis because we need more housing everywhere, but limiting new housing construction in Soho is a conscious choice in favor of higher rents. Given all that, my questions are, number one, in developing the plan, to what extent are you considering the effect of new housing on rents? And not just the Soho rezoning plan, but the Soho rezoning plan as one part of a larger scheme to help reduce rents. So how does the effect of new housing on lower rents come into your planning process specifically? And my second question is, your presentation indicated that your plan aims for about 3,200 units of new housing. Why is that number not higher? Thanks.
Okay, thank you for your questions. So, I think that you raised some really critical points about housing in New York City and our housing crisis that we're experiencing, and especially the crisis related to affordable housing, and people being able to find housing that is accessible to transit, close to places where they work, and in areas that are amenity rich, have good schools and the like. And that is something that motivates us, that we're very focused on in our work, and in, of course, in our planning work in Soho and NoHo. And I think that your specific question about how we take into account the effect of new housing on rents, I think as you mentioned, the issue related to supply and demand for housing not being in sync with one another, is certainly the result of some, if not all, of the difficulty with affordable housing in New York City, and it is something that we bring with us to our planning efforts in our neighborhood plans, in our evaluation of individual land use applications. In the Department of City Planning, we don't oversee all development in New York City. The vast majority of it takes place as of right, and is not subject to special review from the City Planning Commission. But this is something that certainly informs our work, and the very great need to ensure that we are continuing to provide opportunities for new housing to be constructed. 3,200 units, why is that not higher? Again, that is a number that comes from this environmental scoping material and analysis, and it is, again, still subject to change through the process as the proposal is finalized. And whether that number will go up or go down during that process, that is something that we have to continue to develop the proposal itself to inform what the final housing number estimate will be, that will work its way into the final environmental impact analysis. Thank you very much for your questions, though.
Spencer Hurtwolf, you should be able to speak now.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, I noticed that Speaker Johnson's district west of Broadway was cut out of the plan. Was that by his request? And if not, why was it taken out, or why was it never put in the first place?
Thank you for the question. I'll say again that we are at a very early stage of this process, and based on where we are in this process right now, we are hearing from many different people, hearing from a number of people tonight. We continue to have conversations with local stakeholders and local elected officials. And, we'll continue to adjust the plan in response to those conversations as this moves through the process. Our focus is on the goals that were outlined in the presentation. One of the pillars of the plan is about maximizing our opportunity for new housing, new affordable homes in SoHo and NoHo. The map that was shared in this presentation, it does differ from a map that was shared earlier in the process, but it does not result in any changes to the housing projections for the neighborhood. And it still accomplishes the goals that we articulated in our presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. Moving to 2 written questions. Could you elaborate on who was participating in the stakeholder discussions and the focus groups? How are stakeholders determined to be identified for the Envision SoHoNoHo process?
Thanks for the question. First, I'll note that, the full list of focus group participants, advisory group members, as well as others that contributed to the many discussions that the advisory group had are listed on our website as well as in the report. I'll say that the approach was really to be as inclusive as possible, representing diverse interests and perspectives in the neighborhood. I think with the help of the council member's office, as well as the borough president's office, as well as input from the advisory group, which is made up of many people have deep knowledge within the SoHoNoHo neighborhoods. I think we try to call on people that we know that are active in the community, that are business leaders, residents, including artists and those who are not artists, and business owners, property owners, and others to participate. I'll note that among the many public meetings that we had, there's no effort to limit who can participate. I think we took a fairly inclusive approach and try to advertise all of the events and encourage all that were available to attend all of our meetings. We also had an online engagement platform. And I think some of the folks within the neighborhood and beyond also took advantage of that. And I'll note that that is a process that has concluded and culminated in a lot of helpful recommendations in Envision SoHoNoHo report. I think this is the new phase of the neighborhood planning process. And as with all neighborhood planning efforts, we intend to have public meetings and forums where members of the public can attend. And we try to, with this newer reality, try to make our virtual public meetings as accessible as possible. Thank you for your question.
Thanks, Sylvia. Second question is Community Board 2 the only community board that will be involved in the ULURP process? Community Board 3 borders at least one of the housing opportunity areas that would be involved in a significant amount of the findings from the environmental impact statement.
Thank you for your question. That's a very good question. I would say that the environmental review process does look at areas adjacent to the proposed rezoning area to analyze its various impacts. As part of, so it's not necessarily limited to one community district. I will say that typically when rezoning goes through the ULURP process, we typically formally include the community district and the community board that includes the specific area. I think this is a really good flag, and we we recognize that, neighborhoods are not isolated islands. And I think it's important to recognize the different neighborhoods around the study area that is also part of the planning consideration. So I think that is something that involving stakeholders within Community District 3 is definitely something that we'll discuss and consider.
Thank you. We'll move on to 2 speakers.
Pete Davis, you should be able to speak now.
Okay, thank you very much. Considering that you figured out a number, 3,200, you must know where those can fit in the neighborhood. So if you could please tell us how those are going to fit, where they're going to go, that would be useful. Also, the New York Times reported just last week that there are over 12,000 new condo units recently built that are sitting on the market unsold, worth $33 billion. So what is the timeline that you foresee for new construction of 80% of these new luxury units for SoHo and NoHo that would bring with them 800 affordable units? If that's market driven, what is the time frame that you envision that any developer would even think about building new? Finally, air rights. What is the plan for air rights? Right now, those can only be granted, transferred contiguously. Are you thinking in terms of that, and what might that be? And I have many more questions, but I'll leave it to that for right now. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Pete. Sylvia, were you gonna respond to this one?
I was just keeping tabs of the 4 questions, but
Okay.
up to you.
Go ahead, Sylvia. Thank you.
Okay, great. Hi, Pete. Thanks very much for your questions. First, about the number. I think as Eric already mentioned in his answer in some of the other questions, again, the 3,200 new housing units is really kind of analysis that we produced as part of the environmental review to be maximally conservative. In terms of where we see these new housing units being built as part of, for analysis purposes in the environmental review, I would say that, by allowing residential use in SoHo and NoHo, and then introducing densities where appropriate, we, do as part of the analysis, we do see estimated new residential infill developments in different parts of SoHo and NoHo across the district. Again, I think the areas outside of historic districts are areas we see with the most opportunities. That is not to say that, areas within historic districts with lots that are underutilized, can be redeveloped, could not handle additional development. With regards to the analysis period, I think that is a very good question and would be very appropriate for our upcoming scoping meeting. I think now, speaking from the top of my head, I think usually as part of the environmental review, we identify an analysis period. This is not to say, and usually it's 10 years look ahead, right? This is not to say that the city has a crystal ball knowing where exactly development would be developed when. I think this is to kind of put a little bit of predictability in our analysis in kind of understanding the impact of any rezoning actions. And then with regards to the air rights, I think that is something that we haven't, I think that's a new topic that hasn't really come up either as part of Envision SoHoNoHo or after. I can't say that we've really considered that as part of this neighborhood plan, but thank you for raising it. I think Currently, it's not being contemplated that the air rights would be allowed to transfer beyond what they already can't today. Did I miss a question?
Just if I may, Sylvia, just to follow on with what you said about the build year in particular, and the question regarding, which I think was kind of a broad question about, why are we planning for new development here when things such as COVID and the economic crisis that has resulted, mean that there are vacant spaces. And I know that other people are asking similar questions in the Q&A that I've seen. And, I think in addition to kind of the technical response, as to how far we are obligated to look out as part of our environmental analysis for projecting development, planning is an exercise, for the future, something we do now for the future to help set the city up for future success. And, it's something that, we rarely see the fruits of our collective labors in, a short time frame, but it's really critically important work that we do now. And, it may be something, and I think it's completely understandable to look around our city today and wonder why we are, engaged in longer term planning exercises and planning for new housing capacity or, office capacity. But it is really critically important that we begin this work now, so that in the future, when the city is recovering and or recovered, that it is positioned for that future, and we have places for New Yorkers to live and places for New Yorkers to work, and that is really that's planning in a nutshell. And so we think it's very, very important that it continues even at this challenging time.
Caitlin, Holly, you should be able to speak now. Hello, Caitlin.
Kathleen Hulley, are you on with us?
All right, moving on to the next one. Kyle Dontoff.
Good evening.
Hello.
Hello. I just have one question and one comment, if you may be so generous. First is, at the beginning, you mentioned that the neighborhood, SoHoNoHo area, as currently defined, has 7,800 residents and approximately 51,000 jobs. That's, I think, over a 6-fold gap. And many of those workers are fairly low-wage retail and service workers. So I was wondering, first off, what the affordable housing program would do to perhaps set aside some units for those in particular, and more generally, given that Soho was strategically located between the financial district and Midtown, what view, if anything, was being done to take advantage of this rezoning to prevent further displacement and further sprawl, which is not only economically sound, but in a time of climate crisis is, I think, essential. And my second point, my comment was really that, contrary to what some other people have been saying tonight, I really think that this Zoom format is very conducive to more participation, more engagement, because it enables people who can't go to an auditorium at 6 p.m. on a weekday night to take advantage of the process and be involved. Whether you're working as one of these retail workers or whether you're taking care of your family, you can listen in and you can be involved and not have to physically go somewhere. So I would like to see these continue after the COVID crisis has ended. But more importantly, if there are some elderly people who can't take advantage of this technology, then I think we could work to do some skills training rather than shift away from the old format where certain people could monopolize the discussion and skew it and have undue say. Thank you.
Great, thank you for your question. And thanks for your comment about the meeting format. With regards to your comment and slash question about affordable housing for workers that have low wage jobs, I think as we mentioned as part of the presentation, we do recognize SoHoNoHo being a high opportunity area that is near to transit and other employment centers, and it's important for the neighborhood to contribute to the housing supply and help promote housing equity and advance fair housing goals as part of the city. I'll say that recent residential developments that have come to the neighborhood in SoHoNoHo have largely gone through special permit and variance processes and only produced a small number of market rate and luxury units. I think in neighborhoods that are opportunity rich and transit rich, we think that the neighborhood plan, one of the key goals of the neighborhood plan is to use all the tools available to us. That includes mandatory inclusionary housing and others to make sure that we provide a range of options for people of varied income levels. That includes, income levels generally, significantly lower than the median household income in the area. So thank you for your comment.
Thank you, Sylvia. Moving on to 2 written questions. I'll also note I'm just being mindful of the time and want to respect everyone's Monday evenings. So we will take these questions and we'll continue to go until 8:15. So the next question is from Senator Kavanaugh's office. Due to COVID-19, many office buildings in the area are vacant. Could we start by converting that unused office space into housing?
Well, thank you for that question, Senator. Well, I'll say to start right now, no. The short answer is no. We can't do that currently, and that is because SoHo and NoHo are both zoned as manufacturing districts where housing is not permitted. So there isn't a way, short of seeking special permission from the city, for existing office spaces to be converted into housing. As we discussed in the presentation that Sylvia and Nabila gave earlier, one of the things that we are looking at as part of the proposal is to allow new housing to be constructed in SoHoNoHo as of right, that is to say without needing special permission from the city. And that new housing could be located in new buildings constructed or could be located in certain buildings that could be converted. One thing that I think is really important for us to acknowledge is that these neighborhoods are really vitally important job centers now. And certainly before COVID were vitally important. And we do think that the things that made them attractive as office space, and particularly attractive to the creative economy, will continue to exist as the city recovers from COVID and the economic challenges. So I think what is going to be really important as we develop this proposal is to ensure that we're striking the right balance between allowing housing to be created in SoHoNoHo while also ensuring that these job generating uses, these offices, can continue to exist here, can continue to grow and expand, that local businesses can grow and expand. That balance is really vitally important. Thank you for your question.
Thank you. The next question is regarding the map that was in the presentation. Please explain why the blue areas for commercial development and why the side streets are included?
Thanks, Nabila. Thank you for your question. And I think I see some similar questions with regards to the map and the boundaries. I think I'll note that the map is kind of a diagrammatic representation of different zones and different areas with different characters that we see in SoHoNoHo. These are not exact boundaries. This is a very early kind of version as we continue to refine the proposal and kind of devise the actual boundaries of different sub areas within SoHo and NoHo. I'll say that, you know, the reason that certain areas are highlighted in blue as commercial corridors is that these are, you know, areas along wide streets and existing commercial corridors, including Canal, Broadway, and Lafayette. And these are the areas that are characterized currently by larger, in general, larger and taller loft buildings. And these are also areas where large commercial buildings tend to concentrate. So we think that in order to continue to ensure that SoHoNoHo remain, you know, a dynamic mixed-use district and employment centers, special regulations should be devised for these key commercial corridors. Again, the boundaries are diagrammatic at this time, and thank you for your feedback. And I think we'll look at maps in the future and continue to develop them.
Thanks, Sylvia. We'll move on to the speakers.
Caitlin, you should be able to speak now. Caitlin Holly.
Kathleen, are you there?
All right, moving on to the next speaker. Catherine Allington, you should be able to speak now.
Hi, good evening. Thank you for taking my question is related to health impact. I wondered if the plan takes any opportunity to consider not only medical centers, but green space, as well as physician offices. What is the sort of connection to places like the Parks Department and the Health Department in sort of planning for new units in such a densely populated area? I just have one question, that's it. And do you use health impact assessments at all? Is that a tool that you use within in your agency and sort of this part of planning?
Thank you for your question. I do believe that the environmental review has analysis with regards to public health, although I'm not quite sure that it analyzes public health from the angle that you just suggested. But thank you for raising that point.
Next, we have Casey.
Hi there. First of all, thank you for hosting this. I appreciate you making this accessible to people who wouldn't necessarily be able to join us in a basement at 6 p.m. on a weeknight otherwise. My question has already slightly been touched upon, but I want to elaborate on it a little bit. Regarding the affordable units that would be created through MIH, I do want to kind of echo the earlier question about expanding the community district as well as expanding to people who work in the district and not just live in whichever bounds you end up going with. But I also want to ask specifically about affordability levels. As you mentioned, there's a robust housing market in SoHoNoHo, obviously, which allows it to underwrite either deeper levels of affordability or more affordable units through MIH. curious if you can speak to either the levels of affordability or the number of units that you have in mind. In addition, whether you see those being primarily underwritten by the market rate units, or if you think that the city or state might kick in additional subsidy as well. Thanks very much.
Thank you for your question. So when it comes to the affordability levels, that is something that will continue to be discussed during the process. As it's currently envisioned, the entirety of SoHo and NoHo within the study area would be mapped for mandatory inclusionary housing to allow us to require affordable housing in SoHo and NoHo for the first time ever. We think that is, one of the most powerful tools that we have, at our disposal as, planners in New York City. When it comes to the specific options for mandatory inclusionary housing, that is to say, what percentage of the housing should be is required to be set aside, and at what income levels. There's a menu of options to choose from, it covers roughly anything from 20% to 30% of the housing that would be required to be permanently affordable. And the income level assigned to that housing changes depending on which of the options is selected. Where we are in the process right now is not the stage where we identify which of those options is being chosen. That is something that continues to be worked out through the process. It is something that, we hear from the public, we hear from the City Planning Commission, and then during the public review process, ultimately to the City Council, to determine what the final mandatory inclusionary housing option is that is put into place in any rezoning area. That's something that, it's determined throughout the process. So at this point, we don't have a specific answer for you yet. I think it's fair to say that all of the options are currently, on the table, and can be discussed and considered. But thank you for your question.
Great, thank you. So we'll move on to 2 written questions. I'll note that it's 8 o'clock now. We'll go to 8:15, and we've received many questions, and I do see some people also still waiting to speak. I'll note that this will be posted online tomorrow, and we will also be posting the questions that we have received in the next few days on our website as well. So you'll be able to take a look at that at nyc.gov/SoHoNoHo plan. Okay, so first written question is, why not spread out the new housing all over SoHoNoHo instead of packing new residents in 2 or 3 areas, making them super dense?
Thank you for the question. I think it's a very good question. One important thing to note here is that we do have a study area, the SoHoNoHo study area, the map that you saw earlier, about 85% of which is covered by one of 6 historic districts. So I think it is really important as we move forward through this process that we, respect the historic character of SoHo and NoHo within the historic districts. And, that's not to say that development isn't appropriate within those historic districts. It is, as Sylvia has said, that, we look at the various different areas within SoHo and NoHo, not as one monolithic neighborhood, but as a variety of smaller areas within these neighborhoods that each merit their own individual attention, that we pay attention to the character of some of these smaller areas differently than others, and each of those presents specific opportunities. In some cases, they present constraints, and all of those inform the final plan. One thing that is, I think, really important, and I think you're getting at this in your question, is that we do have some areas on the edges of the SoHo and NoHo neighborhoods that are not within historic districts, and also have sites that we do think are more likely for new development in a scenario where they have new zoning put into place. And these are areas where we think it makes sense for new development to take place, new construction to take place. Again, it's not that they will only be in that neighborhood. And I think, as we've addressed earlier, this is not about creating tall skyscrapers in these small areas outside of the historic district. This is about finding the right building shapes and sizes that evoke SoHo and NoHo and their long, rich architectural history, but also the character of the neighborhoods. And but it does require that we take a really careful look on a block by block basis in developing a plan, and that is what we will do during this process. Thank you.
Thanks, Eric. Second question is, what is meant by accommodate and expand live work? Is residential occupancy to be allowed as of right? Most occupants here do not comply with the joint living work quarters for artists requirements. What about us? We want to live in peace and be able to sell our lofts when we are old. Please clarify your housing recommendations.
Thank you for your question. And that is certainly a sentiment that we've heard repeatedly throughout the Envision SoHoNoHo process, especially given the sort of complicated residential occupancies that already exist in SoHoNoHo today and are complicated by the myriads of layers of regulations that are in place. As mentioned as part of the presentation, I think the intention here is to allow residential use and create a mechanism so that the existing occupancies of the joint living workforce of artists can be legalized and transitioned to regular residential use and residential use that also accommodate and acknowledge that the different needs of residential and live work arrangement. The exact mechanism in which that could happen is part of the plan, and we will continue to develop that aspect of the proposal. But thank you for your question. We certainly think that it is very important to create a path forward so that folks that are already living in the neighborhood can have predictability and sense of security in their own homes and in their neighborhood. Thank you for your question.
Thank you. Moving on to speakers.
Next, we have Senator Holman. You should be able to speak now.
Yes. Hi, Senator Brad Hoylman. I just wanted to echo previous commentators who say that this rezoning should be held off until the next administration. I mean, this is the Amy Coney Barrett of rezoning proposals. You have 15 months left. And frankly, under the cloud of COVID, I don't think that appropriate public policy decisions are going to be made. That's my first comment. But secondly, with mandatory inclusionary housing being such an abundant failure in the city's policy making, I think something like 43,000 units of market rate housing that have been constructed. The public has only received 2,000 units through mandatory inclusionary housing of affordable housing. Why aren't we talking about, instead of what a previous speaker said, more than 3,200 units of housing, why aren't we talking about more than 800 units of affordable housing? I think 800 units of affordable is a pittance. And it's a disgrace, in my opinion, that that's on the table. And then secondly, I want to ask you, how is the Envisioning SoHo report a preface to this rezoning? I read the report and frankly, I didn't find any conclusions about a rezoning. Could you answer that question? And then third, do you suspect that you're going to be relying on 421A tax abatements to build this market rate or luxury housing through the mandatory inclusionary housing program? Why not rely on a different tax program that will actually build more affordable?
Thank you very much, Senator Hoylman, for your questions. So I'll work my way through them. I mean, first, as you mentioned, we are, approaching the end of the administration, and why we would move forward with a rezoning at this particular point. I think as I mentioned earlier, we certainly don't feel like it is, we certainly don't feel like it's appropriate for us to halt our work in planning for New York City, for being able to provide housing and economic opportunities for New Yorkers in the future, particularly neighborhoods like SoHoNoHo. We absolutely have time to complete this this process in this administration, and I think as you know. But for the benefit of people who may not be as familiar with the process, as we move through this process, we are moving on, a pretty prescribed time frame. And when this enters the official public review process, we're moving on an actual charter mandated time frame. So we have a good sense of how long this process is going to take, and it can be completed. And we think it is very important that it is completed, and that we do take advantage of this opportunity. The Envision SoHoNoHo report, I think from our perspective, it provides an absolutely clear path for us. And it was a result of a tremendous amount of work and dedication from, the public that attended, all of the meetings, our stakeholder group, and elected officials partners who were process sponsors with us in this process. And it set forward a really wide range of recommendations. That doesn't mean that every single recommendation agrees with every other one that's present in the report. And I think it rightfully respects that there's a wide diversity of views among many people on many issues in the neighborhood. I can say though that one thing that the report speaks to very clearly, are the constraints that come with living with 50-year-old zoning in a neighborhood that has changed dramatically. And the report, as we said, is a really important foundation for us to build off of. And I think of additional importance are the events that have taken place over the past several months, regarding racial justice, regarding COVID and economic challenges, and those I think very much speak to the priorities of examining existing policies and regulations in SoHoNoHo, and how they, are, holding back small businesses in the neighborhood, how they are, not allowing people who reside in the neighborhood today to take advantage of the investments that they put into this neighborhood in their homes, and also how new people could come to live in these neighborhoods, in this really, these two amazing neighborhoods in Manhattan. So we do think that the report speaks very, very clearly to our moving forward. Again, though, we're at the beginning of a process. We're at the beginning of the development of a zoning proposal. And, comments such as yours, such as all the other ones that we've heard in this meeting, are really vitally important as we put together a proposal and a plan to bring into public review. The dwelling units, why not more than 800 dwelling units? I think that, we would be thrilled to be able to to see more affordable housing constructed in Soho and NoHo. We're constrained in these two neighborhoods, number one, by the fact that the city does not own sites in Soho and NoHo where buildings can be constructed. And, that is usually where we look for opportunities to build more affordable housing, go deeper in affordability. And we don't have that opportunity in Soho, NoHo, and that is unfortunate. But it is really about using the toolkit that we have at our disposal to be able to get the maximum amount of affordable housing that we can in the neighborhood. The toolkit is mandatory inclusionary housing, and that is one that we are relying upon here. And we have the advantage in a neighborhood like Soho NoHo of extraordinarily strong private market that can deliver affordable housing without public subsidy, and that is hugely important in a time that we find ourselves in today, where public funds have many different priorities being assigned to them. So we do think that it's an important an important consideration here. And in terms of the tax abatements, I think that this is something that is premature for us to talk about that. That's obviously the result of also individual property owners' decisions as they develop properties. But again, we do have this extraordinarily strong market in Soho NoHo, where the private market can deliver things like affordable housing without the need for subsidy that may be necessary in other neighborhoods. But thank you very much for your question, Senator.
Thank you, Eric. It looks like we have 1 minute left, so we're actually going to end on this. Again, this video will be posted tomorrow at nyc.gov/SoHoNoHo plan. And if you do have questions, we always have our email address, soho-noho@planning.nyc.gov. Again, that's soho-noho@planning.nyc.gov. And we will also be posting all the questions that we've received in the next few days. We really appreciate your time in joining us for today's information session. And we hope to see you at the scoping meeting on December 3rd. Thank you.
Thank you very much for attending.
Thank you all. Good night.
Good night.